Thanks, Mr. Bellucci. It is my enormous pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Stephen Danley. Dr. Danley, Steve, is DeMatha class of '03, and then University of Pennsylvania, class of '07, and did graduate work at Oxford and received his PhD, and he now is a professor at Rutgers Camden. And those are sort of the bare bones. I'm going to fill in a little bit around that so you have some sense of that journey as I've gotten to be privileged enough to watch it. So when Dr. Danley was a student here at DeMatha, we have a project for the seniors which is called the Senior Exit Interview. And we ask all seniors a whole series of questions. Their generosity of spirit is enormous, and we've been able to make lots of changes to the school because of things that the seniors have recommended to us. Years ago, we used to take the seniors on retreat in separate sections, and over again in senior exit interviews, students would say, I really want to be able to go with all of my classmates. We've made that reality. There's been all sorts of examples of that. So, Steve and I, when Steve was a student here, had a wonderful disagreement, actually. Steve would regularly tell me, he was the aide in our office, that forcing people to do service made it not actually service at all. And that's a really interesting, I think, and wonderful argument that a high school student is making it to the principal is even more fascinating in some ways. But Steve and I would have this terrific discussion about whether or not you could do something, whether you could model something. Say we ask people to do service even if they don't really want to do it. Could that help stretch them out, right? Could that help them practice a thing they might not have done before? And then maybe they find out that this actually is something that is central to their core. So we had these wonderful discussions, and not only that, but Steve is something of a polymath, as you're going to hear. He's very interested in interdisciplinary work. And in fact, when he went to Penn, his major was actually a combination of 3 different academic disciplines. That'd be philosophy, political science, and economics. I haven't mentioned actually yet, because this is the Nusca Scholar Breakfast, but Steve kept a pretty extensive co-curricular activity going. He played varsity basketball here for 3 years and then played at Penn and got to be in the NCAA tournament and got to actually write for the New York Times about what it's like to play in the NCAA basketball tournament. When he was a Marshall Scholar and he went to Oxford to study, he wanted to keep this interdisciplinary work going. And his dissertation is about his work that he did in New Orleans post-Katrina. And he has this really keen interest in the way that communities handle and recover from stress and what kinds of things make strong and successful communities. His book is now out. This is my copy of it. I actually have 2 copies, one for reading, one that he signs, and then I just put on a shelf. And when he's even more famous, then I'll sell that. That'll be my retirement income, first edition. But I often think back to myself, I wonder if I could take a tiny bit of credit, because almost all of Steve's work has now been about the nature of service. And through both an academic lens, as you're going to hear, and a really practical lens, as you're also going to hear. It is my enormous pleasure to introduce my good friend and fellow DeMatha grad, Dr. Steve Danley.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay. And of course you can have some credit. I want to, first of all, say thank you for the folks who invited me here today, for Tommy Bellucci and so many of the faculty members, and for you guys for coming out, for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what this place means to me. I want to start off with 2 stories that I want to tie into what DeMatha means for me. And the first one starts with our teachers. It's hard to talk about DeMatha and not talk about the teachers, but I'm going to talk today just about one, about Mr. Carroll. Mr. Carroll is a bit of an eccentric. I had him for AP English my junior year. And at the time, to math, I had a rotating schedule. We still have a rotating schedule? And no matter what time of day it was, whether it was 8:30 in the morning or 2 o'clock, Mr. Carroll would walk into class with his lunch, and he would pull out an apple and a yogurt and eat it during class every time. And so we all had Mr. Carroll stories, but my favorite one is one day we sat down to take an English test. We got about 2/3 of the way through this test, and everybody's hand goes up. And finally, he calls on somebody and we go, Mr. Carroll, we didn't read this book. And Mr. Carroll goes, no, don't worry about it, just answer the questions anyway. And so afterwards, the next day we get into class and we go, what are we supposed to do? Why were there questions on a book we didn't know what was going on? And he told us, he said, don't worry about it, it's on a curve, it's not going to hurt you, relax, it's okay. And I did not find that satisfying. So I showed up during my free period and I said, Mr. Carroll, how can you expect me to answer questions about a book I haven't read? And I'll never forget what he said to me. He looked me right in the eye and he said, Steve, someone had to write that test, figure out what they think the right answer was. And this was a really important moment in my development as a scholar because it was the first time when I considered that tests, that these things we were doing in education, that there wasn't just a right answer. There wasn't just this idea that it was judging me in some way, that these things were constructed. And I started reading tests different ways. I started looking and saying, oh, through all the wrong answers on this test, there's the same misreading of this book. The same misunderstanding. When you look at a math test, there's the same type of mistakes in these things. And I could feel my ability to take tests grow. My relationship with this education process changed. That year, I took the SATs. And it was one of these moments because my scores shot up from what they had been at the PSAT the year before. Actually, Miss Ritz is here, and she pulled me out of class when the scores came in. Because I received a 1570 on my SATs, so just a couple questions shy of a perfect score. And it was the type of score that changes your life, right? There's scores that help you in a lot of ways, that open doors, and then there's scores like that where it changes the narrative about you. It changes the way that schools, that opportunities see you. So hold that first story for a moment. We'll come back to it. The second story comes years later when I'm in graduate work in New Orleans. I did work on neighborhood associations, on the ways that they took ownership over how their communities came back after Hurricane Katrina. And I was doing that work often from an African-American bookstore called the Community Book Center. And I would go there and I would write and I would talk to folks, and it was kind of a home for me. But it was also a place where I was really challenged. And I'll never forget, one day I walked into that space, and folks were talking, and someone came right up to me and put his finger right up in my face, and he said, "You're the problem with this city." I think it's easy to talk about that first story. I think it's easy to talk about all the ways in which these classic educational light bulb moments feed into what we do. And of course, that's the story that gets told when I get introduced, right? This story of getting these scores. And when I applied to Penn, someone actually pulled my application from the file and sent it to an office called the Center for Undergraduate Research and Fellowships with a note that said, this student is going to get a full scholarship to go to Oxford when he graduates from here. My first day on campus, a college coach walked me to that office and I got a job there. So I could start to be incorporated into those opportunities. A direct result of this experience with Mr. Carroll led me there. It was there that I had the opportunity to write for the New York Times. It was there that I was introduced to a faculty member who had just come from the White House. I had a chance to spend a summer at the White House while I was in school. It was there that they helped me apply for this scholarship to go to Oxford, where I ended up doing this work in New Orleans, ended up writing this book, A Neighborhood Politics of Last Resort, which came out this past November. And then the chance to be a professor at Rutgers, where I've been the last 6 years. I think that's the story we like to tell. In many ways, I would say that Mr. Carroll's story, that story of academic achievement, is actually less indicative of maybe the things that I want to talk about today and the things that I think have been more important for my life. And that second story of being challenged in New Orleans and being pushed in different directions is more important. When I got to New Orleans, it was about 3 years after the storm. And so the city was shifting. It was shifting from kind of a fight or flight mode where people said, we're trying to come back, we need to rebuild our homes. And people were starting to say, now what happens? A simple chicken and egg example. If people don't live in a neighborhood, do you reopen the school in that neighborhood, not knowing if people will come back and live there? Or do you wait until people have moved back to open the school? But if you wait, what family with a child is going to move back not knowing if their school is going to open? New Orleans became the centerpiece of these discussions of how can a city recover, what can move on, and right in the middle of that was this discussion about insiders and outsiders. Who was hurting the city? Who was hurting this recovery? Who was taking control away from local communities? And what I didn't know when I walked into the community book center that day, when someone said, you're the problem with this city to me, was that after the storm, every single teacher in New Orleans was fired. 7,000 teachers. Many of those teachers were teachers who had grown up in the community, teachers of color who had been there, who had lived there, who knew the New Orleans culture. And who were they largely replaced by? They were replaced by young, white Ivy League graduates who looked a lot like me. I was walking into that debate, that discussion, that skepticism of outsiders. And that was the starting point for the work I did there. That was the first challenge I had to overcome in New Orleans, was how do you build community? How do you build relationships? When someone sees you, they don't see you. They see the fact that their sister, their brother, their mother, their aunt, their uncle lost their job, and that folks like you are taking those jobs. And yet I had this tremendous opportunity. I had chances to go to this bookstore. I built relationships. People welcomed me into their homes, into their community meetings. I was able to build relationships that were super meaningful across this space. To give you an idea of how meaningful, when I first got my job at Rutgers, the first thing I actually did was I paid to fly up the manager of that bookstore to speak at Rutgers to my students, because they were so important to me and I wanted to share some of those things. We just developed a model this year, right in the same space, around this question of how do you engage with community around service, around learning, around engagement. And this is one of the things I'm most proud of in my work at Rutgers. We now pay that bookstore to hold classes for our students. We pay grassroots groups to give lectures that are accredited by the University of Rutgers. That's how much I value, that's how much we value the work that they do. In a lot of ways, my story in New Orleans was a story of facing these challenges of a segregated society we live in and asking how do we build relationships across them. And when I was about to leave, I spent about 6 months a year for 4 years in New Orleans, going back and forth from school, going there, doing research, working with these neighborhood groups. The activists that were involved in this book project, this research I was doing, they sat me down and they said, we want you to apply for a job to head the coalition of these grassroots groups. And I said, I'm here to learn, I'm really honored. Why would you want me to do that? And they said, we don't know that many people who can come to a grassroots meeting and hear us and understand what we're saying and be a part of this grassroots community here, and then fly to New York and dress up in a bow tie and go to a swanky fundraiser and impress donors. We need people who can move across those two different worlds. And that's been one of the things I think about all the time when I think about Dematha. Where did that ability come from? Where did that ability to move across these different spaces and these different worlds? And when I think about it, I go back actually to my freshman year here. Played basketball, and we were on the back of the bus. It was a day with particularly bad traffic. The freshman and JV team were going to an away game. And whenever we were in the back of the bus, this is before the headphones era. So now when people play, right, it's all headphones, everyone's focused, they're listening to their music. But what we used to do is sit in the back and someone would get a go-go beat started. So I know we have some young folks here, you may not be super familiar with go-go. I hope some of the parents at least know what we're talking about. So we'd sit there and somebody would be up on the window and, excuse me, I'm not the world's best go-go beat. But it's like, boom, 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 right? And we right? Every commercial that came out with a new jingle, every new hip-hop song, the whole time. But I remember this day because we're stuck in traffic and we're just doing this for an hour. We're in the back of the bus, boom, 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 boom. And for whatever reason, we just always came back to the Power Rangers theme song. Go, go, Power Rangers, go, go, Power Rangers. And I remember it because it was one of those moments where my world got bigger, right? Where I was exposed to something different, where I was a part of something different. I was preparing for this and I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today. And I reached out to a couple of my classmates who were on that bus. Shaka Dickerson, who was my point guard while I was here, and one of my very dear friends. And Brian Murphy, who's actually here this morning. And I was like, do you remember that day on the bus and the Power Rangers? And they were like, no. And I was like, why not? And they said, because that was every day, right? That was every bus trip. That was every day when we were at the lunchroom where we were having these experiences. You know, I asked Murph, he goes, that was every day in study hall for me, right? And so when I think back about DeMatha, I think about this fact that there aren't many authentically diverse places. We live in a very, very segregated society, and DeMatha is genuinely and authentically diverse. And I think that matters in ways we don't think about when we think about education. I also circle back to Shaka and Murph and a few other folks, and I said, what was it about your DeMatha education that has kind of pulled through and been important to you? And this idea came up over and over of being able to move across different worlds. And the fact that moving across different worlds is something that's a part of being here and a part of this community. I think a lot of folks think of this as kind of a touchy-feely skill. And I want to push something different today. I want to argue that this is actually a central skill to our modern society, and it's something that we should value. It's something that should be a part of these decisions around where we go to school and what we do. Think for a moment of my colleagues who have graduated and ended up in sales, and being asked all the time to walk into different communities, to make genuine relationships as a part of your job, so that you're not walking in and exploiting a community, but you're walking in and communicating and understanding what their needs are and how you can be a part of that with your work. Think for a minute about the type of work you do if you're a manager in a corporation. When you're asked to bring together a team of folks who may come from different backgrounds and communicate with all of them, so that folks aren't left behind when there's times to move up within the corporation, so that folks aren't left behind when there's responsibilities to share. Think about folks who do nonprofit work, NGO work internationally, and are asked to walk into new communities, build relationships so that the work they do around aid and around building and around development doesn't harm communities but helps communities. And of course, I think about the work I do as a white professor who works in an urban university teaching and doing research in communities that often look very different than I do. And I want to make the case that that's vitally important for your education. It's vitally important to have that skill, but it also matters for society. We live in a society that has a problem with segregation. And you can look at our politics and understand it from minute one, but I'm also talking about housing segregation. I'm talking about a legacy of redlining, of housing discrimination that echoes the current struggles we face as a country. This is the dominant reality of my day-to-day life. I live in a city, Camden, New Jersey, that's one of the most segregated from the surrounding region of the country. And I live day-to-day that legacy of housing discrimination and redlining. A mile from my house is a trash-to-steam plant, a city municipal waste plant, a cement factory, a steel crushing plant, 2 Superfund sites where companies left environmental hazards. And the legacy is that when that community segregated, when you saw redlining, when you saw white flight, when you saw that separation, one community ended up with power over another community. And that community with power got to say, we're going to put the stuff we don't want, the waste plant, the trash-to-steam plant, the cement plant, next to your homes. This is a central issue in our community, and too often it trickles into our conversations about schools. Too often, what we hear are, there's research that shows that the best predictors of a school's reputation doesn't have anything to do with the experiences people have with teachers in that school. It has to do with stereotypes about the students in the school and about the student body. Now, I've been to some of the best institutions in the world. I've been to Penn, I've been to Oxford, but none of them taught me to work across these spaces like DeMatha did. So often, fighting segregation is pitched as some sort of charity. It becomes a tokenism. We're going to help people. It's going to help people towards equality. I have a lot of problems with that model. One of the things I love about DeMatha is that the authentic and genuine diversity here is real. It's a diversity that taught me that these places can be beautiful places to grow and learn. It opened up my world, it opened up Shaka's world, and we both gained from that in a lot of different ways and took that on to school. We compared notes. Shaka went on to school at Columbia and then Vanderbilt. I went on to school at Penn and Oxford. And at Penn and Oxford, I was often asked, why didn't you go to Georgetown Prep or St. Albans? And those are amazing schools. And I think, if I'm honest, right, I think just as my scores rose with Mr. Carroll, my scores would have risen at those other schools as well. But I can only do the work I do right now in Camden, New Jersey, because I went to a school that valued authentic and genuine diversity. DeMatha taught me not just to move across these different worlds, but that I needed to be humble and listen to different communities and different perspectives. It gave me skills to connect and do the type of research and the type of work I want to do in different schools. And it did the same thing for Shaka. So Shaka navigates the DC school system by day, and then this past week he actually went out to LA to pitch his startup to investors, moving across worlds. I'll always be eternally grateful to DeMatha for that experience, that education that started in the back of a bus listening to Go-Go Beats. And I'm honored to be here with you as you embark on this.